So good morning to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and I would really like to thank the organizers for inviting the ICRC to participate and to give an overview of our work on the protection of the natural environment in armed conflict. So first, and Professor Sassoli started with this, and I will mention only a few examples, but I think it's important also to put the wider work in the context. Why are we working on it, and why is it important? So as we have already heard, armed conflicts have always been a threat to the natural environment, and can lead to its degradation or destruction, and thereby threaten also the well-being, health, and even survival of the population. These threats can take many forms. For instance, as was mentioned, direct attacks on the environment. Here an example is the use of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. Also the release of hazardous substances as a result of attacks on industrial sites, for instance in Kosovo in 1999, but also in Lebanon in 2006. And these attacks and the release of these hazardous substances can result in water, soil, and land contamination. Other examples are the actual or potential use of certain means and methods of warfare, for instance, biological and chemical weapons. And finally, as was also mentioned, the exploitation of natural resources. These impacts can extend over large areas and continue for years or even decades after a war. And here I think it's important to highlight the importance of the draft principles that we just heard about, that apply particularly in situations after armed conflict, related to remediation, cooperation, because indeed some of these effects go far beyond armed conflicts, and so it's important to keep that in mind. The consequences of armed conflicts have been and continue to be a source of concern for the international community. This is reflected in continued efforts to clarify and strengthen the international legal framework that does protect the environment in situations of armed conflict. And as we have just heard, the International Law Commission has just adopted on first reading 28 draft principles, which is an important achievement, although we have also heard some work is still to take place. For its part, the International Committee of the Red Cross, as guardian of IHL, works to reaffirm and clarify IHL rules that protect the natural environment in armed conflict, and to promote these and try to work with states to implement them. So in line with this, the ICRC issued what were called at the time the guidelines for military manuals and instructions on the protection of the environment in times of armed conflict, after a consultation with a group of international experts. And these were finalized in 1994, as has been mentioned. After finalization, they were then submitted to the UN as part of the International Decade of International Law. And at its 49th session, the UN General Assembly, in a resolution, annexed the guidelines and recommended states to give due consideration to these and to the possibility of incorporating them into military manuals and instructions. So the aim of the 1994 guidelines was really to facilitate the integration of IHL norms and to improve awareness among the armed forces, as well as contribute to training on the protection of the natural environment. Since the publication of the guidelines, of course, the international legal framework has continued to develop, and more importantly, or more sadly important, is that the negative effects of armed conflicts on the natural environment have also continued. Although the impact of these hostilities is acknowledged, its scale is still largely underestimated, and often it is not the priority of warring parties. The focus is on civilian protection. And so this, in a way, highlights the continued need to promote and generate greater respect for IHL rules on the protection of the natural environment. So based on this, and in line with the recommendation of an expert meeting that was organized in 2009 between the UN Environmental Program and the ICRC, we have been working to revise the 1994 guidelines, essentially with the aim of reflecting developments in treaty and customary law. And here I mention in particular the clarification of customary law in the view of the ICRC as provided in the 2005 Customary International Humanitarian Law Study. So in the next minutes, after this brief introduction, I would like to just give a brief overview of the scope, the purpose, and the content of the revised guidelines. And then just to say a few words on the next steps and what is still to come. So what exactly are the revised guidelines? And here I'll often compare and go back to the 1994 ones just to show what some of the similarities and differences between these are. As the 1994 version, the revised guidelines focus exclusively on how IHL applies to the protection of the natural environment. However, although I say exclusively, I think it's important to also mention that we do look at how other rules of international law are important for the protection of the environment and may continue to apply in armed conflicts. So as was mentioned, I think by both Professor Sassoli and Ambassador Leto, the guidelines are a restatement of existing law. They do not aim to create or develop new obligations. And as such, they are really a collection of existing rules. The difference, the notable difference with the revised guidelines is that as compared to the 1994 version, these also contain commentary that accompanies each rule with the aim of clarifying what the rule is, what its source in law is, and also to help in the interpretation of the rules. So similarly to the 1994 guidelines, the aim is that these can serve as a tool to facilitate the adoption of concrete measures to promote, implement, and apply IHL rules on the protection of the natural environment. However, their scope is larger in the sense that the 1994 guidelines really were focused on armed forces and the integration into military manuals and instructions, whereas the revised guidelines really seek to act as a reference tool for parties to armed conflicts primarily, but then also for other actors that may use these to influence the behavior of parties in an armed conflict. So before looking at the content of the revised guidelines, maybe just to emphasize from the start two of the key takeaways of these revised guidelines, and this was also mentioned by Professor Sassoli, and I think it's one of the most important points, is that first, the natural environment is civilian in character, unless, of course, specific components of it have become military objectives. And as a result, all the general IHL rules that protect civilian objects must be applied to it. This is perhaps one of the main differences also in the revised guidelines, in the sense that they focus, they try to bring light a lot more to these general rules of IHL that provide protection to the natural environment. For instance, here I highlight the principle of distinction, proportionality, precautions, knowing that the effects of armed conflicts on the environment are often indirect. For instance, the principle of proportionality is quite important to consider. And then the second takeaway is that in addition to all of these general rules, there are also specific rules that protect the natural environment and that have that as their primary purpose. So, although damage to the natural environment is, of course, inherent to armed conflict and will continue to happen, and as also we have heard this morning, many of the effects of armed conflict on the environment are actually not due to IHL violations. So that, I think, is important to recognize, but also to emphasize that IHL does contain important rules that do protect the natural environment and that can contribute to diminishing the effects on the environment and also, of course, to reducing the vulnerability of civilians in armed conflict. And these are the rules that the guidelines aim to look at. So to start and to look a bit more at what the content of the guidelines are, they first look at general considerations. For instance, what is the notion of the natural environment in the context of IHL? Also general questions related to how IHL protects the natural environment. And as I mentioned already, how IHL rules interact with other rules of international law that protect the natural environment. So then, after these preliminary considerations, the guidelines then look at the first type of protection, which I've already mentioned, which are the specific rules of IHL. And these include the prohibition on methods and means of warfare that may cause long-term, widespread, and severe damage to the natural environment. And in addition, the prohibition of using the destruction of the natural environment as a weapon and of attacking the natural environment by way of reprisal. The guidelines then give an overview of the second type of protection that we've already spoken about, which are these general rules of IHL that also protect it, without this being their primary purpose. And these include the general protections granted to the environment as a civilian object. I've mentioned the important principles and rules of the conduct of hostilities here. But also rules related to the protection of specially protected objects, including objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, which of course includes foodstuffs, crops, and water. And also the prohibition of regarding works and installations containing dangerous forces, which we also heard about this morning. In addition to that, there are also rules related to enemy property, for instance, the prohibition of pillage that are of relevance to the natural environment. In addition to the rules on the use of certain weapons. So here we can think of the prohibition to use herbicides, the prohibitions to use poison or poisoned weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, but also other rules related to restrictions on landmines and to minimize the effects of explosive remnants of war, for instance. And these can also be relevant after an armed conflict as well. Finally, as a last section, the guidelines also look at the broader rules of IHL related to respect, implementation, and dissemination. And of course, these relate to all of the rules of IHL, but they're quite important. As we've heard, one of the main challenges is implementation of international humanitarian law. So this section highlights how the obligation to respect and ensure respect for IHL, but also other rules on the obligation to provide instruction to the armed forces and to investigate war crimes can also be relevant or are very relevant, actually, to the protection of the natural environment. So that's a bit the overview of the content of the guidelines. And to close maybe on the next steps, We're currently at the stages of finalizing the guidelines. So indeed, they are not yet available online. We submitted the guidelines to a group of about 26 external peer reviewers, so academics and practitioners, with the aim of improving the quality of the guidelines. And here I'd like to thank very much my fellow panelists and Professor Boisson de Chazourne, who have very kindly provided feedback and have been part of our peer review process. And basically what we're doing now is taking into account and considering the feedback that has been provided by these peer reviewers, to try to, make the guidelines as useful and as good as possible. And the aim of this current revision, or what we're currently aiming at, is to finalize the guidelines and publish them by the end of this year. As we've said, despite the existence of these important rules, the main challenge is implementation, and not only implementation into national law, but more importantly, application and practice. And so the focus of the ICRC's work, once the guidelines are published, will move to this. We'll move to looking at how to promote them, how we can recommending that they be incorporated into military manuals, instructions, but also more comprehensively in domestic regulatory frameworks and policies, as well as in military training, operational planning, and decision making, because it's of course here that we can see how they will be applied in practice, or to try to get them to be applied in practice. And as part of this, the guidelines will be featured notably at the 33rd International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, which will take place in December of this year, possibly through a side event, but in any case, they will be part of the report that the ICRC presents to the conference every 4 years on the challenges to international humanitarian law. And just in closing, maybe to mention that one of the other measures that we're working on, also as part of this international conference, is the development of a model pledge. And the idea of this model pledge is to really focus on the protection of the natural environment in armed conflicts, including through the guidelines, but the focus being broader. And the aim of this is that it will be used by states and national societies and tailored to national contexts for adoption at the international conference that I've just mentioned. And this pledge recommends, for instance, practical measures that can be taken to improve protection, for instance, delineating particularly fragile zones so that armed groups, armed forces know that these are particularly fragile in the event of an armed conflict, but also carrying out prior assessments of what the impacts of an attack will be on the environment, for instance. So our hope is that through these pledges, implementation of existing rules can be improved. And of course, we welcome very much your thoughts on how we can promote the guidelines, how we can promote IHL rules, and happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.